While you were sleeping, China just completed a military encirclement that took 2 decades to build. And 99% of people have no idea it even happened. Australia, a nation of 26 million people, is now surrounded, not by water, by Chinese military infrastructure on islands most people couldn't find on a map if their life depended on it. And here's the part that should terrify you. America is 7,000 miles away. China? They're already at the front door. This isn't some distant future threat. Just weeks ago, in December 2025, Australia's Foreign Minister Penny Wong went on public record with a warning that sent shockwaves through defense circles. China is more frequently projecting military power further into our region. Translation: the encirclement is complete. The noose is tightening, and the clock is ticking. So what happens if America doesn't respond? Stay with me for the next 7 minutes, because what I'm about to show you will completely change how you see the next decade of global power. Let's rewind the clock. For 20 years, China played the longest, most patient game in modern geopolitics. While America was stuck in Middle Eastern wars, Beijing was quietly writing checks across the South Pacific. The Solomon Islands, Kiribati, Vanuatu, Tonga, Papua New Guinea, Fiji, one by one, like dominoes falling in slow motion, they signed deals with China. Ports upgraded, airports modernized, communication towers installed, all wrapped in the friendly language of economic development and infrastructure partnership. But here's the part they buried in the fine print, the part most media won't tell you. Every single one of these projects has what's called dual-use capability. That shiny new port can dock Chinese destroyers. That upgraded runway can launch military transport aircraft. That communication hub, perfect for signals intelligence and surveillance. It's like building a military base without calling it a military base. And then came the bombshell. In April 2022, the Solomon Islands, sitting just 1,200 miles from Australia's northeastern coast, signed a secret security pact with China. When the draft leaked, the world finally saw what was really happening. The agreement? It allows Chinese military forces, armed police officers, and naval vessels to deploy to the Solomons to protect the safety of Chinese personnel and major projects. That's not a partnership. That's a foothold. Now let's talk about the geography. Because once you see this map, you can't unsee it. From California, the closest U.S. mainland point, to Australia's coast, 7,000 miles. That's a 15-hour flight for military aircraft, assuming they don't need to refuel. From Chinese-accessed bases in the Solomon Islands to Australia's mainland, a 2-hour hop. 2 hours. Let that sink in. American reinforcements, 15 hours. Chinese forces, 2 hours. But it gets worse. China now has access to strategically positioned infrastructure across at least 11 Pacific Island nations. 11 separate countries that now have diplomatic and economic ties to Beijing. In April 2025, Newsweek published an explosive investigation revealing that China has quietly constructed dozens of dual-use ports, airports, communication facilities, and research stations at key strategic choke points across the Pacific. These aren't random locations chosen by throwing darts at a map. They form a calculated arc. They surround Australia from the northeast to the northwest. They control critical sea lanes where 40% of global maritime trade flows. And they sit directly on top of undersea fiber optic cables that carry 99% of international internet data. And here's the chilling part that keeps defense analysts up at night. China doesn't need to officially call these military bases to use them as military bases. They can maintain plausible deniability while achieving strategic dominance. In October 2024, 2 Chinese Navy warships, a destroyer and a support vessel, docked in Port Vila, Vanuatu. The first time Chinese warships had ever made such a port call. No advance warning, no diplomatic fanfare. They just showed up, stayed for 4 days, then left. Message sent, message received. Okay, so why should you, sitting wherever you are right now, care about islands in the South Pacific? Fair question. Here's why. 40% of all global trade by volume passes through the South China Sea and surrounding Pacific waters. Australia exports $135 billion worth of resources annually. Iron or liquefied natural gas, coal, wheat, beef. If China controls the choke points around Australia, they control economic leverage over the entire Indo-Pacific region. Still think this doesn't affect you? Let me put it in perspective. Between 2020 and 2023, China slapped $20 billion, $20 billion, in trade restrictions on Australia during a political dispute over COVID origins and human rights. Wine? Tariffs up to 200%. Barley? 80% tariffs. Coal imports? Unofficially banned. Now imagine what Beijing could do with a military presence on Australia's doorstep. That's not economic competition. That's economic warfare with a gun to your head. And here's the asymmetry that matters. Australia's total active military personnel? About 60,000 trained soldiers, sailors, and airmen. China's People's Liberation Army? Over 2 million active personnel. The comparison isn't even close. It's like bringing a knife to a gunfight. So let's do what military strategists do. Let's game this out. 3 plausible scenarios for how this plays out. Scenario 1, the silent blockade. China doesn't need to fire a single shot or invade anyone. They just make it progressively more expensive and dangerous for commercial ships to reach Australian ports. Insurance rates skyrocket. Shipping companies reroute. Supply chains fracture. Australia's export economy, which represents 25% of their GDP, gets slowly strangled without a declared war. It's economic asphyxiation in slow motion. And there's no clear red line that triggers a military response from allies. Scenario 2, the gray zone warfare. This is the nightmare already unfolding. China uses these Pacific bases to deploy what they call research vessels, massive fishing fleets with 200 boats and heavily armed Coast Guard patrols. Not technically military warships, but armed, organized, and following orders from Beijing. They harass Australian naval vessels. They swarm around disputed areas. They test boundaries, probe defenses, and escalate inch by inch, always staying just below the threshold that would trigger Article 5 of the ANZUS Treaty with America. It's war without calling it war. Scenario 3, the Taiwan crisis activation. A military conflict erupts over Taiwan, and suddenly, all these Pacific bases light up like a switchboard. China activates them to create a defensive perimeter preventing U.S. reinforcements from reaching the Western Pacific theater. Australia becomes strategically isolated. American carrier strike groups are stuck 7,000 miles away trying to break through a multi-layered defensive network. And that's the scenario 3, that has Pentagon war planners running computer simulations at 2 in the morning. So, is anyone actually doing anything about this? Yes, but they're racing against time and they're playing from behind. Just last month in December 2024, Australia signed brand new security agreements with 3 critical nations, Nauru, Papua New Guinea, and the Solomon Islands. They're offering $2.2 billion in development assistance and $1.3 billion in climate financing to Pacific Island nations. It's a desperate diplomatic offensive to counter China's influence with checkbooks and promises. But here's the problem. They're trying to rebuild relationships that took decades to establish, and they're doing it in months. The United States is finally waking up to the threat. They're deploying new hypersonic missiles to the Indo-Pacific, the Army's Dark Eagle system that can strike targets 1,700 miles away. They're establishing new rotational bases. And in June 2025, they conducted massive war games with Australia spanning 4,000 miles across the region, involving 50,000 personnel. But, and this is the critical but, China is already there. They've been building relationships, cutting ribbons on infrastructure projects, and embedding themselves in Pacific Island economies for 2 decades while we were distracted. Australia's Foreign Minister Penny Wong said it with brutal honesty. We know that Australia can no longer be the only partner of choice in the Pacific. There's no rewind button. Translation: the game has fundamentally changed. The board has been reset, and we're starting from a position of disadvantage. Now let's step back and be completely honest about what's really happening here. This isn't a simple story of good guys versus bad guys. This is about raw power, strategic geography, and who controls the chessboard of the 21st century. China isn't doing this because they're evil. They're doing this because they're trapped. Look at a map. The so-called First Island Chain runs from Japan through Taiwan, the Philippines, down to Indonesia. It's a line of U.S. allies and partners that effectively boxes China in. Every ship leaving a Chinese port has to pass through waters monitored by countries aligned with Washington. For Beijing, the Pacific Islands represent an escape route, a way to break out into the open ocean and project power beyond the defensive perimeter that's contained them since the end of World War II. America, meanwhile, wants to maintain freedom of navigation and prevent any single power from dominating the Indo-Pacific. It's the same strategy they've pursued for 75 years. Keep the seas open, keep allies secure, keep potential rivals contained. And Australia? They just want to wake up each morning not surrounded by military infrastructure controlled by a government with fundamentally different values and strategic interests. The Pacific Islanders themselves? They're caught in an impossible position. They need economic development. Roads, hospitals, schools, ports. China offers that development with no political strings attached and construction crews ready to start next month. Australia and America offer smaller amounts with longer timelines and lectures about governance and transparency. Can you blame them for taking Beijing's money? They're trying to lift their people out of poverty, and China is the one showing up with open checkbooks. Here's why all of this matters right now in late 2025 and why the next 24 months might be the most critical period in modern geopolitics. Taiwan. Everything comes back to Taiwan. They're trying to lift their people out of poverty, and China is the one showing up with open checkbooks. Here's why all of this matters right now in late 2025 and why the next 24 months might be the most critical period in modern geopolitics. Taiwan. Everything comes back to Taiwan. If China decides to move on Taiwan in the next 2 to 5 years, and multiple intelligence agencies believe that window is opening, this entire Pacific network instantly becomes militarily active. These ports become forward operating points. These airfields become launch platforms. These communication hubs become command nodes. The Pentagon's 2024 China Military Power Report, published just weeks ago, explicitly warns about this strategic shift. The report states that China is systematically building the capability to project military power past what's called the Second Island Chain. The Second Island Chain includes Guam, home to Andersen Air Force Base and Naval Base Guam, the only major permanent U.S. military installations between Hawaii and the Philippines. Guam sits 3,800 miles from the U.S. mainland. That's closer than California, but not by much. If China can neutralize or threaten Guam using long-range missiles launched from bases in the Pacific Islands, they effectively push American power back to Hawaii, 5,000 miles from the action. At that point, the tyranny of distance becomes America's worst enemy, and Australia finds itself on the front line of a conflict it never wanted, surrounded by infrastructure it can't control. Now, before you start panic buying canned goods and building a bunker, let's inject some intellectual honesty and look at the counterargument. China has repeatedly stated these infrastructure projects are purely for economic development and civilian use, not military expansion. And to be completely fair, many of these Pacific nations genuinely want Chinese investment. The ports are helping local economies. The airports improve connectivity. The roads and bridges are making life better for ordinary people. That's real. That's not propaganda. China's ambassador to Australia, Xiao Qian, said clearly in 2024 that Beijing's security presence in the Pacific is not a military strategy and should not be a source of concern for Australia or anyone else. And honestly, he might even believe that. Or at least, that might be true for now. But here's the uncomfortable truth that history teaches us. Every major rising power in the last 500 years said their expansion was peaceful, defensive, and purely economic. Right up until the moment it wasn't. The British Empire was just protecting trade routes. The Soviet Union was just creating a defensive buffer. The United States was just promoting democracy and free markets. Intentions change. Capabilities don't disappear. So where does this all lead? What's the end game? I see three possible paths forward. Path 1. American reassertion. Washington goes all in. Massive infrastructure investment in Pacific allies. New permanent bases. Ironclad security guarantees. Economic packages that match or exceed Chinese offers. China, seeing the costs escalate, backs off from further expansion. We return to something resembling the old status quo, just more expensive and more tense. Path 2. Manage competition. Both sides recognize they're on an escalation ladder neither can afford to climb. They establish tacit rules of the road, unwritten agreements about what's acceptable and what crosses red lines. The Pacific Islands become a neutral buffer zone where both powers can operate, but neither dominates. Nobody wins. Nobody loses. Everyone stays below the threshold of actual conflict. Path 3. Escalation and miscalculation. Incidents at sea between naval vessels. Gray zone conflicts that spiral. A fishing boat sinks in disputed waters. A surveillance plane gets too close to a warship. Somebody misreads intentions. And then we're in territory nobody wants to talk about. Because nobody actually knows what happens when two nuclear-armed great powers stumble into a conflict neither actually wanted. Right now, at the end of 2025, we're somewhere between Path 1 and Path 2. There's still competition, but it's mostly diplomatic and economic. But we are one miscalculation, one accident, one crisis away from sliding into Path 3. So here's the bottom line. The thing I need you to understand if you take nothing else from this video. Australia, a wealthy, democratic, stable nation of 26 million people, is now strategically surrounded by infrastructure controlled or influenced by a rival power. China has been systematically building this network for 20 years, while most of the world wasn't paying attention. In America, Australia's primary security guarantor, is 7,000 miles away across the largest ocean on Earth. The question is not whether this matters. It absolutely matters. The question is whether anyone will take decisive action before the window closes completely. We are living through a historic strategic shift right now, in late 2025. Australia's foreign minister didn't mince words. China is projecting military power more frequently and further into our region. That's not analysis. That's not speculation. That's a government minister stating reality. This is the opening chapter of a story that will define the balance of power for the next 30 years. And unlike previous great power competitions, this one is happening in an era of hypersonic missiles, cyber warfare, and economic interdependence that makes every move riskier and every miscalculation more catastrophic. So, I want to hear from you. What do you think happens next? Is this the opening move of a new Cold War in the Pacific? Is this just smart, defensive strategy by China? Or is this something else entirely? A new model of great power competition we don't even have words for yet? Drop your analysis in the comments. I read every single one. And if you actually made it this far, to the 8-minute mark of a geopolitics video, you're in the top 1% of viewers. Seriously, most people scroll past. But this is the story that matters. This is the story that will shape your world. Hit subscribe if you want more deep dives into what's actually happening behind the headlines. Not the sanitized version, not the clickbait version, but the version backed by facts, sources, and strategic analysis. China has already won the first round of this competition. They're on the board. They're in position. The question for 2026 and beyond is, what happens in round two?